That is probably one of the toughest questions. When you talk about military superpower, the first thing I think of is sort of national military power, the amount that a country can actually bring to bear militarily. And then we have the issue, are we interested in what they can bring to bear right now, actual military power, how many tanks, planes, personnel they currently have? Or are we more interested if we're thinking about longer-term conflicts or longer-term peacetime objectives? Are we concerned about a society or a nation's ability to turn latent power, for example, innovation or civilian industry or reserve forces, into actual military power? And then the definition changes over time. Political scientists have tended to use sort of backwards definitions, things like steel production. That was very important in World War II. Also, the amount of people that are serving in the military. But nowadays, if you look at the countries and you try to say, okay, which country has the strongest military, and you rank them based on how many people are in the military, what you end up having is the least effective militaries with the most people, and now the most effective militaries with the least amount of people, because we're moving into a more capital-intensive type of military force structure. When people ask this question with interest in China, for the most part, what we're interested in is military effectiveness, sort of force on force. So then there's less interest in comparing the Chinese military parallel to a military like that of the United States. We're not interested in how their fighter aircraft compare to U.S. fighter aircraft. What we're interested in is how U.S. fighter aircraft can deal and manage threats, for example, from air defense systems. The last thing I would say about the superpower issue is I think we've only ever had one, historically, really, and that is the United States. What we try to do in metrics and political science is make something generalizable, and it's very difficult to detach military superpower, that term, from the United States, which has established its own definition involving, for example, a forward deployed presence that is the result of the Cold War. Now, operationally, if you look at, for example, U.S. forces in Europe, they don't actually help us project power in a more timely manner than keeping them in the continental United States. Or forces in Asia, for example, that because of certain vulnerabilities, we're unlikely to use them in an actual contingency. But the United States can't pull back these forces because of what it will signal. So I bring this up just to say that a future military superpower, what that force structure will look like and how active and how it will be active in the international system, is bound to look very different from what the United States has done, because it has the benefit of learning from what has been effective and ineffective for the United States. So the short answer is no. I don't think China, the party, currently has global ambition in the military sense. I just want to clarify, though, because a lot of cases when people say that, you think I'm just trusting sort of Chinese strategic intentions. So I want to just first say that I think China has those types of ambitions for the region. I think that in an ideal world, China feels like it could be and wants to be the regional hegemon, in which it has certain expectations, for example, that its preferences are accommodated above all other countries. And more you can see in Chinese writings, official statements, that the position that U.S. military presence is destabilizing and harmful towards China and could actually thwart China's goal of sort of reaching this position of regional preeminence is on the increase. So I think China has those ambitions regionally. But if you look at how they're talking and thinking about the global environment, there just is very little evidence to suggest they have those same intentions there. Not only is there little evidence to suggest that they want to have the same level of involvement globally on that in the military arena as a country like the United States, but there's a great deal of writing that suggests that they think actually that level of involvement is ineffective. So I would say something like China arguing that it doesn't want to be involved in domestic political struggles over power is not so much because they don't have the capabilities to do so, but because they evaluate how the United States deals with its policies, for example, in the Middle East. And they've come to the conclusion that those are very costly, and in the end, the United States doesn't get what it wants. So I don't think China has the ambition to be involved on that global scale with the PLA. However, there have been significant changes in how China is currently assessing its global interests and its overseas interests. In recent years, their commercial interests abroad have increased, and with that, the amount of risk that they're opening themselves up to has also increased, not only because they are doing business in many politically unstable environments where things like seizure of private property or nationalization of certain critical industries such as natural resources, where China is doing a lot of business. These areas, those types of threats are very high, and also the threat to personnel working overseas is very high. So what you end up having is commercial interests, a lot of which are state-owned enterprises, a lot of which are run by sort of wealthy and influential people in China. They have the desire of those interests to be protected. And then you have Chinese citizens which are traveling and working abroad. And by some estimates, by 2020, you're supposed to have 100 million Chinese overseas at a given period of time. And the domestic public opinion has shifted in the past 7 years such that the Chinese people expect that their government can protect them. The question, especially during this economic downturn, is why do we pay so much for this military if in the end there's nothing we can do when a Chinese person is captured, held hostage, or executed, like in the recent ISIS execution. So the government is very sensitive about this. If you look at the social censorship that occurred after the ISIS execution, it shows that they're concerned about the domestic political pressure to act. So you have those, I think, domestic political interests and commercial interests. And lastly, a little bit more fuzzy, but the international system, this idea that China should be a responsible stakeholder. And I think the leadership recognizes that certain types of global expeditionary operations, for example, NEOs, the evacuation of citizens abroad, or humanitarian aid and assistance, things like this, improve their image and maybe help them deal with what they call the China threat theory or other countries' suspicions of their interests. So there's a lot of reasons for them to be partially involved and their military to be involved in perhaps permissive, like the degree of contestation being limited, those types of environments. But I think the idea that all of a sudden they're going to throw out their ideological and practical aversion to things like military bases, and we're going to see Chinese, troops on the ground holding permanent places around the world, or that they're going to help the United States in coalitions to promote what we consider to be U.S. interests at the detriment of Chinese interests is highly unlikely. For me, I think the most interesting aspect of this question is more in the personnel soft modernization. So since the 1990s, when China really embarked on this military modernization program, the focus was on equipment and hardware. The aircraft that China had, the surface vessels that they had were so antiquated. They were basically obsolete. My favorite thing I first learned as a China specialist was the original Taiwan invasion plan, which involved fishermen paddling over to Taiwan, right? So the first step for the Chinese military was obviously building, acquiring indigenously or from elsewhere, originally from the Soviet Union and then after the collapse from Russia, the equipment that it would need to conduct higher level operations. I think to a great degree, China has caught up in a lot of key areas when it comes to the equipment. Of course, we can talk about certain areas where they're behind, like their engines in their aircraft or microprocessors or things of that sort. But for me, what is really critical now, and I think if you look at what Xi Jinping has decided to focus on during his tenure, are these areas of soft modernization. Personnel issues, retention, development of their forces. You now have a large Chinese military that is dominated by the army that has no realistic training. I always say that if you have to publicize the fact that you were able to move your forces from one part of your country to another part of your country, that suggests that you have very bad mobility. Right? And if you have to brag about the fact that you did some sort of exercise that involves some live fire, it suggests that the troops just aren't trained. And they're not getting good quality troops either. They've missed their quotas for college-educated people year after year. And that's largely because they need serious reform to how they treat and manage and train their people. So in the end, when it comes down to it, you can have really great equipment, but unless you have people that know how to use that equipment, And you have command and control structures that allow for autonomous decision making. In China, you have military officers doing jobs that we have junior enlisted personnel do in the United States. We have non-commissioned officers that are the heart of our military service that have more autonomy than perhaps a general does in China. Right? So unless they start changing that type of system, when it comes to the fog of conflict, it's gonna be difficult for them to make decisions in a timely manner. Now, the bottom line is no one really knows the degree to which these issues in personnel training and management actually will impact their military effectiveness. China hasn't fought a war since '79. They're testing some operational issues out with the Gulf of Aden deployments or maybe even UN PKOs. But the United States, for better or for worse, is a country that's been at war for decades. And with that comes a learning process, a diagnostic process that we have in place that the Chinese just don't. So I think it will make the Chinese military more effective if those reforms are successfully implemented. And I'm confident that they will be. I understand that there's a lot of very smart commentators who would say that there are a huge amount of entrenched interests in the Chinese military that, for example, don't want to reform the military regional system, or they don't want to reform the promotion system, et cetera, because it's harmful to those that are currently in power. Or the army, of course, that doesn't want to give up its decades-long hold over the military, dominating every aspect of command and control within the Chinese military structure, even though this makes it such that China would never be able to conduct effective joint operations. So I think if I had to place a bet, it would be that these reforms are going to be implemented successfully. And I think it's really because the higher level leadership, especially Xi Jinping, is putting all of his efforts into this reform. People who focus a lot on elite politics and who might be greater experts than myself on the personality of Xi Jinping would largely argue that he's embarking on these types of reforms to consolidate his power over the military, that there's been questions about the degree to which he has control over the military. I think there is significant evidence to suggest that he might be actually more pragmatic. Of course, I think the anti-corruption campaign that he's currently launched, which has been the most pervasive anti-corruption campaign since the 1980s, undoubtedly does consolidate his control over the military to a degree. But I think to a large degree, he is being motivated by these desires to improve the operational effectiveness of the PLA. The call to prepare for military struggle, which he has vocalized a number of times, I don't think is directed as a threat to other countries. It's not that China is, goose-stepping its way to a conflict in that region. It's the idea that they have already poured so much time and effort and money into this military modernization, and there's an expectation from the party, but also from the people, that when the time comes, the military will actually be able to perform, and there is an intense fear that it won't be able to. So I think things like, reforming a lot of the command and control structures, and this huge reform in which they just took these 4 general departments that were sort of seen as their own fiefdoms and in control of everything from procurement to logistics, now fall under the control of the CMC. These will have lasting and important effects for the ability of the Chinese military to operate. And I wouldn't bet on the failure of these reforms to go through.